Hey guys, I figured I would do your notes maybe a little bit differently today. I wanted to try and do what I could to help you out with explaining it myself. I know I can't be there with you, and it's hard to ask questions live or anything, but I thought maybe this would be helpful. These are going to be our notes for chapters 18 and 19. I can put the pages up if you want to read more about it or if you need more of an explanation that I'm not able to give you in these notes. It is chapters 18 and 19 that I kind of condensed down to just the highlights for the Great Depression and the New Deal. So kind of like Hoover and FDR's presidencies. Essentially, how this started. It started because of four different main causes. Okay, so I kind of split this up into two. So my first one here, the first cause is risky investing or overstretching. So basically what that means is about 70% of Americans were kind of living at the poverty line at that point, and they overstretched themselves by borrowing too much on credit. So if they needed something new, or remember the Roaring Twenties was kind of a time of like buying all this new great stuff for my house. So if people wanted or needed something, they would buy it on credit. So they would go to the store and ask to borrow money or ask for or not necessarily to borrow money. How do I explain this? So let's say you went to Pick and Save and you couldn't afford what you were buying, but you had a running tab, so to speak. So you have an account with Pick and Save and they just charged you for it and you could pay for it when you had the money. So essentially, they would let you take your groceries and you would pay for them when you could, kind of thing. And if you ran up too high of a balance, they would stop letting you borrow things or pay for things later. And that's kind of how a lot of people lived. Like I said, this is over 70% of Americans at this point. So that's a lot of people. So the Roaring Twenties was not necessarily roaring for everybody. It was a roaring time for the whole economy, but not for individual people as a whole. The other thing that they did was they bought stocks on margin. So people wanted to make a quick buck. They wanted to be part of the Roaring Twenties and actually experience all the wealth and quick money that other wealthy Americans had experienced at that point. So they started buying in the stock market, which by itself is not a problem. But when you do this thing like buying on margin, it's essentially using credit to buy more stocks than you can afford. So say I had $100 and I wanted to buy stocks, but I really thought that this one stock was, a no-fail thing. It's a railroad stock and it's for sure going to go up because they're opening all these new rail lines. And so I bought $1,000 worth of stock because I bought on margin. I only paid 10% as a down payment for how much I wanted to actually buy. Now, if my stock did well, if that $1,000 worth of stock went up and I suddenly had $10,000 worth of stock, cool. Then I could pay off my stockbroker that I had borrowed that money from, that $900 in the difference between what I had and what I, bought. However, if that stock then suddenly goes down, like we have this crash, we have the panic that happens during 1929. If that stock value goes down, that $100 that I put down in order to buy the $1,000 worth, that suddenly becomes a problem because I don't have 900 extra dollars to pay that back if it doesn't do well. So essentially, I was buying things with money I had no business doing because I couldn't afford it. And now I'm really stuck. So what happens was I couldn't pay back the person that I bought it from. And then they can't pay back what they owe because they loaned the money to me. And then it's kind of a domino effect. So what that ended up leading to was the fact that the US stock market was really hyperinflated. It seemed like everything was going amazing, that the Roaring Twenties were for sure roaring. But what really was happening was that people were doing all this speculation and buying stocks that really weren't as valuable as they were more valuable than they should be. So say, Mr. Schultz starts up his own math tutoring business, but he doesn't show up most of the time. And, it's just really not a great business. It's not making a lot of money. but it's a cheap stock for his company. So I figure, well, it's really cheap. It's a penny stock. So I'll buy a bunch of it and sell it when it goes up, to 2 pennies. And then I've made double my money. And then that goes back to this get rich quick idea. Even though Mr. Schultz's math trading business is not a great investment because it's not a solid business. So that ended up having the values of stock being way too high versus what they were actually worth. So when rumors started to spread in the papers that major investors that owned a lot of stock in the stock market were going to sell their stocks, so they were going to pull out of the stock market, that panicked people because they knew that they had done all this buying on margin, that they speculated on bad stocks, and they were afraid of what was going to happen if they lost their money in that stock market because they didn't have enough to pay it back. So essentially, rumors started this whole thing, and people just started selling a ton of their stock all at once. Over 16 million shares, if you can see at the bottom here, were sold on what's called Black Tuesday. So October 29th of 1929 is known as Black Tuesday because that's when the big crash really happened. 16 million shares were sold in one day. That's worth over $30 billion at that point. That would be hundreds of billions of dollars at this point. So if you can kind of get an idea, like $30 billion is the amount that the entire U.S. Population earned in that whole year. And that was just taken away all on that one day. The third cause then was what was going on with the banks. Banks in the 20s were not very well regulated. They didn't have a lot of laws telling them what they could and couldn't do. So the big problem with that is there was no insurance. The government did not insure your money. If the bank went under and they had your money, well, I guess you lost your money. You should have put it in a better bank. That was kind of the attitude at the time. However, what banks wanted to do it was the roaring 20s. They wanted to get involved in the stock market too, because, who doesn't want to get rich? And so essentially what would happen is you or me, we would go and put our money in a bank, thinking it was going to be safe. We put away $100 each. And the bank essentially can use that money however they want to, as long as eventually they're able to give it back to you when you need it. So that's kind of how they operate. Well, what banks in the 20s did was they took that investor money, the people that deposited money, and took it to the stock market and bought it on margin. They speculated on bad stocks just like individuals did, and they lost a lot of money after the crash. So they couldn't repay their loans to people that had deposited it. And that's kind of what this little cartoon over here is talking about. Essentially, what happened was everyone went to the banks after the stock market crashed and wanted to pull their money out all at once. Well, the banks had lost a lot of people's money and couldn't pay it, and they went bankrupt. So this one here shows you, like it says, victim of bank failure. So this man had put all of his money in a bank to keep it safe, and the bank lost it in the stock market. And the squirrel's asking him here, like, why didn't you save money when things were good? Why were you being so irresponsible? That's kind of how the government viewed people at that point. And he's like, I did save money, but the banks lost it because there was no laws saying that they couldn't do that. And like I said, there's no insurance. So if the banks lost it, oh well. And then finally, the last cause is just kind of something really broad. It's just the idea of how much inequality there was in America at that point. It was even worse than it is today. Like I said before, over 70% of Americans were living at the poverty line. And the roaring 20s were only roaring for that top 5% of people. They controlled a lot of the wealth in America. So it seemed like America was doing well, which it was, but not for individual people. And poor Americans really couldn't keep the economy going by buying consumer goods. So when the big wealthy people lost a lot of money, or when a lot of the businesses went under, they couldn't buy and sell and trade, consumer goods anymore. And these people living down here in the poverty line, they couldn't afford to buy, new irons or new, vacuums or whatever was on the market at the time. So they couldn't keep the economy going themselves. And then the other big problem was the farmers. During World War I, they had essentially the government had asked farmers to take out loans to get new equipment, so that they could keep up with the demand for food worldwide during World War I, because we provided food to our allied soldiers as well. And so the farmers, okay, well, if you're going to loan us all that money, like, we'll take it then, and we'll produce a bunch, because then they had good times as far as making money went. But then after the war, that demand for food went way down, because we weren't providing to soldiers anymore, and we weren't providing to European countries anymore. So these farmers had taken out these huge loans, and there was no demand. Not no, but there was a way less demand for food at that point. So their crop prices went way down, and they couldn't afford to pay back those loans. So they went under as well. And that's a huge sector of Americans at that point. So that's kind of all the causes. I know that was a little long-winded. I promise I'll pick it up here. So what was life like during the Great Depression? I think the best way that I can describe it is to point you to this lovely picture here. This was taken by Margaret Burke-White. We talked about her. She was a famous photographer. She did a lot of photo series during the Great Depression and then World War II after. So these people are all standing in line in a city in a bread line, waiting for free food from a charity. And it says right behind them, "We have the highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way." So within a year of that sign being put up, everyone right here is lined up because they don't have homes or jobs because our stock market crashed so badly. And then down here is a picture of some of the shanty towns, or Hoovervilles as they were called later, that were put up in the cities. This is basically just found cardboard and scrap metal and stuff that people put together as their homes in the middle of city parks because they had nowhere to live. Over 25% of Americans were unemployed at that point. That's 12 million people looking for jobs. So that's the highest we've ever had in our history. Over 30,000 businesses had gone bankrupt by the early 30s. Over 90,000 banks had failed because of the bank runs. They had lost everyone's money. And then everyone was extremely hungry. You were lucky to get one meal a day if you got into the bread line at a good time, or if they didn't run out for you. A lot of people were homeless. Like I said, they put up those shacks in public places. They were called Hoovervilles because Herbert Hoover was the president at the time. And people started to really blame him because he had kind of a I'm going to stay out of it kind of attitude to fixing the economy. He figured the market would right itself on its own. And people really hated him for that. A lot of people, this is where like the terms hobos and riding the rails. If you guys remember from reading Bud Not Buddy, he's kind of like a hobo during the Great Depression because, families were kind of torn apart at this point, and people were kind of left to fend for themselves. Like I said, farmers lost their lands due to those high loans that they were given and they couldn't pay back. And then what's really concerning too is down here, like I said, the family was kind of really under pressure during the Great Depression. A lot of fathers, especially men who had come home for World War I, and already, had some of the PTSD and shell shock and stuff that we talked about last week, were really, really deeply depressed by the fact that they couldn't provide for their own families anymore. And they felt so much grief over this that they just left their family to see if they could get a job and send money back. But what it essentially did was left a lot of women and children kind of on their own to fend for themselves. And often times, they would band together. Women and children from different families might live together in like their shanty town homes or things like that, or try to, move into somebody's house collectively and help each other out. But what's really saddest about this is a lot of times, if you had a family or a relative or a friend that was slightly better off than you, as a parent, you would maybe to decide, especially if you lived in a city, you would maybe decide to send your child to live with this friend or relative that was slightly better off than you so that they could eat. And if you can just imagine like being, 2 or 3 years old and being separated from your parents and you don't know why or when you're going to see your parents again, that's terrifying and really sad. So life during the Great Depression, obviously pretty depressing. But there was a huge cultural response that changed American culture really deeply during this time. Obviously, everything was really hard to deal with, and people were not sure if and when this was ever going to go away, if things were ever going to get better. So a lot of times, like the books and movies and radio shows and stuff like that, they had this kind of escapist mentality. So essentially, what that means is like they would try to do something in a book or a movie that was like a huge adventure, and really like try to help you escape from your horrible life for a little while and think about something fun and different. So like Hollywood movies started doing animated films or animated comics or something like that. Like Mickey Mouse became really popular during this time. Disney really exploded during this time. Snow White was the first animated movie ever released. Um, if you can believe it. If you ever watched that, that was definitely a new innovation in the style of animation, but it's also something, that's fantastical. That's something, totally escapist. It's completely, fairy tale esque, so that people didn't have to think about how horrible their life was at that point. The Wizard of Oz, again, very escapist mentality. Like you're looking at this lion that can talk and a tin man that's alive and, witches that exist and stuff like that. Or movies like Gone with the Wind. It's really long, but I highly recommend, since you have the time now, to watch Gone with the Wind if you're able to. This was a movie that definitely changed people's perspectives on their lives, because it was about the Civil War, and how racially charged that movie was. Kind of definitely highlighted racial issues in America during the Great Depression. Really, really good movie. But again, make sure you have like 3 hours to watch it. So radio shows became really popular at this point too. Families would gather around, like in this top picture here. They would gather around this big radio. Yes, this is a radio. They were huge. They're kind of like the size of entertainment centers now. And they would listen to adventure shows like The Lone Ranger or The Green Hornet. Comic book characters became really popular at this point, or soap operas like The Guiding Light. So they would listen to their stories all the time, or listen to like novels being read, kind of like similar, I guess, to like when you listen to like my audiobook versions of things. And then eventually that'll become really important down the road when we talk about FDR here. And then authors kind of went either one way or the other. Either they tried to help people escape from their problems, or they tried to highlight and capture the serious trials that people had during this time. I think you guys will end up reading something from Steinbeck, whether it be Of Mice and Men or Grapes of Wrath. So both of those are stories about the Great Depression. Grapes of Wrath kind of highlights the issue of Okies leaving during the Dust Bowl to California, and how they just lost everything, their family home and things like that. And then we have like your photographers like Margaret Bourke-White and Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange did both of these shots down here. She actually traveled around and followed a lot of the Okies. These people are all Okies. And submitted her photos to Life and Time, and so did Margaret Bourke-White. Margaret Bourke-White's famous for her shots of like bread lines and soup kitchens and stuff like that. Just trying to show how much suffering people were going through, especially to the people who were wealthy at the time, and kind of thought that regular Americans were exaggerating their issues. And then to add insult to injury, and you can watch this video, I'll include just the slides too. But to add insult to injury, Mother Nature also kind of struck the farmers at the same time the Great Depression did. Essentially, what caused the Dust Bowl was a lack of understanding of science. They overfarmed, they got greedy, or just tried to, farm as much as they could to get what they could out of the land. And they would farm the same type of thing in the same field for years and years. And what that does is takes all the minerals and nutrients out of the soil and basically erodes it. So it makes the topsoil really loose and really useless, I guess. It's very dusty. And then that kind of led to the topsoil, eroding. And then you have massive droughts come through in the 20s. And that essentially led to these big clouds of dust that would be like a storm, like it would come over the entire land. There were over 72 dust storms just in 1934 alone. Super dangerous for people and animals that were in the area. A lot of times people would get lost. They would tie, my great grandma told me this story. They lived in the Dakotas, but that was so like they were kind of on the edge of this, but they lived in the Dakotas and they had cousins who lived in Nebraska. And they said that their cousins would tie a rope from one end of their barn to their house so that if a dust storm came through, and they would come through really fast or really suddenly, they would keep a hand on the rope and essentially go hand over hand all the way from the barn to the house in order to make sure that they weren't out there and actually like suffocated because there was so much dust in the air that it could coat the inside of your lungs and kill you. It also, of course, like damaged homes and cars and farm buildings. Sometimes cars would be completely buried. People would have dust up into 4 feet along the side of their house. It was just insane. So watch this video if you get a chance. You can kind of see some of those images and some recollections from people. So how did this all affect the government itself? So I had kind of said earlier, Hoover notoriously did not handle this very well. He kind of thought America's, as the rugged individuals, like they'll figure it out, they'll pull themselves back up by their bootstraps kind of thing. And he refused to increase government spending because they already couldn't pay their debts, which, think of it what you will. But he did try to develop like public works things where he created jobs for people. It didn't create a lot of jobs compared to the 12 million people that needed them. But, at least he tried that kind of method. He did try to save the banks. He wanted to increase the circulation of money supply. So he wanted the Federal Reserve to print more money just to get more money into the economy, but they refused to do it. They didn't want to approve it because they didn't want to bail out big businesses. They didn't think that would be a good strategy. Obviously, we do that now periodically, so think of that what you will. But it is done now. So they created the National Credit Corporation. So it was kind of like a credit place that banks could borrow from so that they could stay afloat and give depositors their money back. And they tried to do that, but you had 90,000 banks that were going under and more banks going under every year. So it didn't really help. So that was kind of fail number 2. And then he tried to do like the Reconstruction Finance Corps by, lending out big loans to like banks and loan companies and railroads and, industries that were, doing like public works and stuff. That failed as well. He also did not like the idea of giving direct relief to people. So meaning like he didn't believe that the government should send out checks to people. Again, irony, because that's what's happening right now. So he didn't think that Americans needed, relief payments from the government. People would handle it by themselves. But by 1932, he realized that the state governments couldn't keep up anymore and eventually signed the Emergency Relief Act, which put $1.5 billion into state and local governments' hands, and sent out checks worth $300 million to citizens directly. However, poor Hoover, or maybe not poor Hoover, whatever you want to think, none of his efforts really did anything to slow down the fact that the economy sucked. And then what ended up happening was people just resented him to the max. These hunger marches and huge protests and stuff sprang up across the entire U.S. And definitely a lot in Washington, D.C. Farmers began kind of like burning and destroying products, including their own crops, to try and raise prices and demand for food and things like that. They were doing extreme things because this is a really extreme time in history. I hope I'm trying to get that kind of across to you guys. And then one thing that happened that kind of sealed Hoover's fate was this idea of the Bonus Army March. Okay, so what ended up happening was during World War I, all the soldiers that fought and were considered veterans, they were promised $1,000 bonus check from the government at some point. It was supposed to be 10 years after the end of the war, if I remember right. Yeah, I think it was 10 years. Anyway, so I have to look that up. But they were promised this $1,000 bonus check, and essentially they wanted it early because of how bad the economy was doing, which makes sense. They had been promised it, and Hoover denied it. And even though all of these veterans had gathered in Washington, D.C. to try and force him to sign the bonus checks and send them out. They were called the bonus marchers. He said no, and then he ordered General Douglas MacArthur. He had been a big general in World War One. He had ordered MacArthur to clear out the camps of all the bonus marchers and the veterans. And MacArthur had wanted to use force. Hoover said no, just, ask them to leave. Do what you can to be diplomatic. MacArthur, defied his orders and used violence and fired on the homeless veterans. You can imagine how well that went over, that were there for the bonus march. And people hated Hoover for that, because they thought that was by his orders, or that he didn't do enough to prevent MacArthur from firing on their own veterans. So obviously people blamed Hoover, the Republican Party in general, for the economy getting worse and worse. And by 1930, so only 1 year into the Depression, they already had lost 100 seats in Congress. And 1932 election rolled around. Hoover didn't even get the nomination for a second term under the Republican Party ticket. And instead, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, as I'll call him, was voted in 1932. So his response to the Depression was completely opposite. He wanted to give Americans what he called the New Deal, access to a better economy. He was going to do everything within his power, he said, in order to kind of rescue America from this situation, and try and pull us out of this depression. He didn't really have a clear plan, which he kind of made clear to everybody. But by the time his first 100 days in office had rolled around, he'd already passed 15 acts to try and slow down the spread of this economic depression. He realized that nothing was going to happen if people didn't believe in him and if people didn't believe in the banks. And he knew that your economy can't run without banks, because no one can get loans without it, and nothing moves if there's no money being lent and borrowed. So essentially he did two things that were huge. He created what's called a bank holiday. He shut the banks down for like a weekend, and kind of reorganized them. He closed down the ones that just were not working and weren't going to be able to stay afloat, and deemed the other ones, necessary. And he said that these are the ones that will survive. So after the bank holiday was over, he reopened them, and essentially said to people, we're going to go forth and create this FDIC and SEC to make sure that banks are only following regulations and not playing the stock market with your money, that money will be there. He boosted the confidence of people in the banking system. And then he did something that was truly brilliant as far as politically. He started what's called fireside chats. Yes, I got it from him. And he essentially went to the radio that was hugely popular at the time and spoke directly to Americans on the radio every night. letting them know what he was doing, what his plan was, how things were going, and tried to boost their confidence in all the things he was doing, and mostly their confidence in the bank system. And then people did start to actually go back and put some money in their banks, and that picked up a little bit. Side note, so again, my great grandma lived through the Depression, used to tell us stories about this stuff all the time. And when we cleared out her house after she had to go to an assisted living place, we found tiny amounts of cash stashed everywhere. Like she had peeled back like parts of her wallpaper all over the house and had stashed cash there. It was in pillowcases, inside socks, like everywhere, because she had lived through this and she just never ever got over the idea that banks would lose her money. And so she never trusted them and she never put her money in banks. So it always kind of makes me smile when I think about like the bank holiday and the fireside chats and stuff, because you'll find that if you talk to a lot of your older relatives, either they or like their parents remember doing things like that, or still did things like that because of how traumatic this time was. But anyway, so a couple other things he did here, you can read a little bit more about it, but essentially he created new systems that were like large scale actions, aimed at like making sure that people had fair competition, that they had fair wages. He, started the minimum wage, fair hours for people kind of thing, and help businesses kind of tackle some of those issues without unions bringing them too far down, that they would close. So he kind of walked the line between workers' rights and businesses' rights, in order to keep people going. And then again, I'm not going to go through every single one of these. You can look at these yourself, but he created so many new agencies that had all these 3-letter acronyms. It's incredible. There's like 20 something of them. That I can think of. I'm sure there's more. They became known as FDR's alphabet soup agency. So if you see here, like the WPA, the PWA, the AAA, they're all agencies that he created. So it's a political cartoon saying like, oh, look, they're playing Ring Around the Rosie with FDR, with all of these things that he put into place. But essentially all of these are aimed at like the Public Works Administration, the Civil Works Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps. They were basically aimed at finding any jobs possible, like fighting fires, building new roads, building, public park paths, anything, to put people back to work. And that did create several million jobs. So that did help quite a bit in terms of getting people back to work. He also funneled like direct relief to homeless people, to like local, state, and local governments. That Emergency Banking Relief Act, like I said, he closed those banks and then essentially had the Treasury Department evaluate how good the ones that were left were. Essentially, he created all of these new things and all of these new people to oversee what was really going on, because he believed essentially that a lot of this was created because there was not enough government regulation in the economy. So basically what I want you guys to remember from this too is that, right or wrong, this Great Depression era, this New Deal stuff, this is kind of the precursor to all of the government regulation that we have today. And whether or not you like government regulation is your own business. But that is the reason why we have such a structured economy with our government that we do today. So big deals as far as no pun intended, as far as what that means for the future of America. And we'll talk about kind of how this all ended in World War II, as the economy picked up during wartime next time. So hopefully that helped you guys. Hopefully it wasn't too long-winded or too confusing. But if you need any further explanations, obviously reach out to me. I'm happy to help you at any time. All right. Take care of yourselves. Stay healthy. See you guys.